GD Politics podcast. I'm Galen Druk. Even before the mid-decade gerrymandering wars began, the 2026 midterms were on track to feature the fewest competitive House districts in modern elections. According to Cook Political Report's ratings, 84% of House districts are solidly in one camp or another. 7% are likely Republican or Democrat, meaning that 91% of districts aren't particularly competitive, and 30 states don't have a single competitive election for the House. That's before gerrymandering may take more competitive seats off the table. It's a tricky moment for, well, the country, and also for good government groups that have long pursued election reforms like independent redistricting commissions. Common Cause, which is frequently sued over partisan gerrymandering, said it won't fight California over its proposed gerrymander. According to the nonpartisan group Unite America, which has also pursued independent redistricting reforms, this makes reform to primary elections, where the vast majority of midterm elections will essentially be decided, all the more important. Unite America advocates for open primaries in which all voters, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, unaligned voters, can cast a ballot, and candidates from all parties compete together. They also advocate for instant runoffs, also known as ranked choice voting. Here with me, in part to make the case today, is Richard Barton, a fellow at Unite America and political science professor at Syracuse University. Welcome to the podcast, Richard.
Thank you so much for having me, Galen. Happy to be here.
So first, before we talk about primaries, I do want to talk about partisan gerrymandering. Do you think, in some ways, it's time to give up the pursuit of independent redistricting reform at the state level? Like, instead turn to this, I guess, mutually assured destruction of maximal gerrymandering that could eventually result in, federal reforms as opposed to this piecemeal state-level reform process?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I guess I should say, so I'm a research fellow at Unite America, and the organization's position is certainly that we should continue to protect, preserve, and expand independent redistricting because it's better for democracy. Certainly in the long term, I as a academic and researcher certainly agree with that. I'll be honest, when I think about this from the perspective of what should the Democratic Party do, how should they be responding right now, and whether or not the efforts in California are the right approach, this is something I have personally really struggled with. I struggle with it because, on the one hand, I think that there is not going to be an electoral penalty for pursuing these kinds of reforms, right? I think one of the reasons why we see the continuous violation of these norms and more constitutional hardball, like doing things to the max, technically within the rules, but violating what used to be seen as acceptable among the general public. We see more and more of this because there is no public backlash from these kinds of actions. And I don't think Democrats are going to receive any sort of electoral boost for taking the higher ground here. So when you couple that with the fact that there's certainly going to be some seats, Republicans are going to pick up some seats in Texas and perhaps other states. Like I see where the Democrats are getting that sort of calculus.
Why don't you think there's a voter backlash to playing constitutional hardball, as you called it?
Well, I think most voters are not institutionalists. So, even in survey responses, we see a lot of voters, like huge numbers of voters, huge shares saying that they think gerrymandering is a huge problem and that they disapprove of it. But historically, we see very few voters who are actually going to change their political behavior in response to these kinds of actions of constitutional hardball. And we've done a recent survey of primary voters, of Democratic and Republican primary voters. We oversampled them as well as the general public. This is part of a sort of a consortium of scholars that we called ourselves that we're part of the primary election survey. And what we found, we asked them. So me and my colleague from Unite America, Carlo Maycumber, we created survey questions asking about political beliefs that were not simply left-right policy ideology, and about commitment to liberalism, democracy, openness to political violence, populism. And what was really interesting is we found that, I'll be honest, my initial hunch was that primary voters in both parties might be less committed to liberal democracy than general electorate voters. And what we found instead was that there was real polarization among the primary electorates, where Democratic primary voters were more supportive of democratic liberalism. They were actually less populist than Republican voters. But what was really interesting is that Republican primary voters were actually closer to the general electorate. Like, it was general electorate voters are actually seemingly less committed to democratic liberalism than I would have sort of assumed
Than
going into this,
Democrats, at the
than
very least.
Democratic primary voters.
Okay, so that's part of the reason that there isn't a penalty to the constitutional hardball. That
Yeah.
the general electorate just isn't voting on this, even if Democratic primary voters may be enraged by it.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we're going to come back to that survey, but I want to ask a broader question here, which is that I think Unite America essentially sees House elections in this moment as broken. They're probably not alone in thinking that. But what are sort of the problems as you see it? Mainly a lack of competition?
Yeah. So there are so few districts in this country and states, both at the at the federal level, but also especially at the state and local level, that where there is inter-party competition, right? And so general elections are just overwhelmingly uncompetitive. As you mentioned in your intro, right, we're expecting 91% of congressional districts to be safe seats, on relatively uncompetitive between the parties. And that means that like all the action is happening in the primary, right? It's the primary essentially where the representative is decided. If you win the primary of the dominant party in that safe district, you are almost certainly guaranteed to enter government. And so that changes the strategic calculation for candidates and for legislators in office.
How so?
Well, it gives them a strong incentive to prioritize their primary voters, donors, interest groups that are active in their primary, as opposed to the kinds of groups and voters that determine the outcome in competitive general elections.
Okay, so this gets to be something of a controversial area of political science, of how representative are the primary electorates of the broader country. And I want to get to that in a second. But first, what do you see as the solution? Can you explain in an ideal world, like how you fix the problem of uncompetitive elections and elections that are largely decided in primaries?
There are several factors that have contributed to the sort of dwindling of competitive congressional districts, state leg districts, et cetera. Of course, there's partisan sorting, geographic sorting that's happened over time. And gerrymandering is a part of that, right? And I think if we look at the sort of projected gerrymanders that we anticipate seeing in Texas, California, perhaps Missouri and other states, like that's just going to make it even worse, right? We're going to have even fewer competitive districts. So there's a number of sort of factors that have gone into that. And so reform, right? So you might say there's very little that we can do to try and make general elections more competitive, other than trying to support independent redistricting commissions and try to prevent further gerrymandering. I think that would have some impact. Like the U.S. Senate isn't gerrymandered, right? But we still see a lot of problems in the U.S. Senate as we do in the House. So this isn't simply a matter of gerrymandering that's causing the problem. So I think the solution has to be to create a system where voters that make the difference in the election that matters, in the meaningful election, are more representative of the general electorate in a given district. And so what that can look like is reforming the primary system, as you mentioned in your intro. So creating a system where all voters are participating, all candidates are directly competing against each other.
So you mentioned that the problem in the Senate and sort of that the problem exists in the House as well. Can we define what that problem is as you see it? What's wrong with American governance today? In a single sentence, if you will. No, but jokes aside, like, what is the problem as you see it?
So the problem, I mean, I think that there's multiple problems, but if I had to pick one, I think we have a governing structure where power decision-making is intentionally fragmented, right? That's what separation of powers, bicameral legislature, federalism, like that's what it was intended to do, and it does that quite well. So when you have a system like that, and you have a two-party system where those two parties are highly partisan and ideologically polarized, there tends to be very little that's getting done. And so there's like this is a big problem that I don't think primary reform alone is going to sort of like fully make our government more functional, but it can go a long way, because one of the reasons why our legislative bodies are so polarized is because the sort of voters and donors and activist groups that are sort of bringing them into office are not representative of the general electorate, which is less polarized, far less polarized than what you see in Congress.
Yeah, a lot of times you hear folks who advocate for reforms like this talking about moderation. So I guess one is the general electorate. Are you saying that the general electorate is more moderate, and so more representative government would be more moderate? And then also, sort of like, just to make sure we're covering our bases here, like, what does moderation accomplish? Like, is moderation a goal in and of itself?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't think moderation is the goal in and of itself, right? And this can be a sort of, this is, I think, a kind of a complicated question, and one that you've probably unpacked in prior podcasts before. So the electorate is more moderate, right? And moderate can mean a couple of things. It can mean that like an individual might be classified as moderate if they are generally taking positions that are on a list of policy issues that are sort of between the left and right, right? They might be moderate in that they have sort of cross-cutting preferences. So they might be like, yes, build the wall on the Mexican border, but also please expand Medicaid and Medicare, right? And so so if you include all those voters into this sort of moderate camp, yeah, they make up the majority of the American electorate. And they suggest, I mean, if you look like whether they are sort of somewhere, stationed somewhere in between the two ideological camps in each party, or they just have cross-cutting issues, it sort of suggests that most voters want a bit more pragmatism and problem solving within their government, because they are sort of, they are flexible. Their views suggest that they are interested in more dynamic coalition building than we actually see in government.
Okay. In an ideal world, how would U.S. House elections work?
So I'm working on a book right now, and I'm sort of framed it as comparing our current system of partisan primaries to two like very different alternative models. And the first one is based on what I think a lot of other political scientists sort of generally think we should do. Like, from a lot of other political scientists' perspective, the problem is that actually we've let the nominations become too democratic, right? That we should go back to smoke-filled rooms, or maybe vape-filled rooms if they were to be like in the present moment. But like, we should go back to a time where party bosses were sort of hand-picking nominees, and that's who was going to represent the party in a general election. And there's some logic behind that. I mean, if the political parties are strategic coalitions of political elites whose primary pursuit, what binds them together, is that they want to win back or maintain control of government, then they're going to select candidates that have broad appeal.
And that's how lots of other liberal democracies around the world choose candidates.
Right. This isn't like unprecedented, for sure. So I take that model, and I have different like empirical methods for trying to infer like what things would look like in that counterfactual. And we have some real world, we have variations in how democratic the nomination systems are. We have some states where conventions are still used, they're closed primaries. We also have techniques to try and infer what the preference of the party establishments are, which candidates they prefer. And so we can say, like, in a world where the party establishment's candidates are always winning, how would Congress look different? So that's one option. The other is we actually go further in democratizing the nomination process. And the theory here is that one, there were perhaps real problems to that sort of party bosses sort of closed system to begin with, but that maybe the relationship between a democratized nomination system and a dysfunctional government is not a simple linear system where more democratization is bad. Maybe we are just at this really bad place where we've democratized to the point where there are certain voters and donors and groups behind just the party establishment that have influence, but they're still rather narrow and they're not representative of the broader public. So the alternative is like let's more fully democratize the nomination system, and that's what open all candidate primaries would represent. And we have models of what this looks like in practice in, the top 2 system in California, in the top 4 system in Alaska, and a few other states.
One question here is the system that we have today has lasted for over half a century. I mean, it came to be in the late 60s, early 70s, and it seems like that system worked for at least some period of time. But what has changed today is not the system, because it's been around for decades. It's the people participating in it, right? Whether it's the voters or the leaders or the media or whatever. So in focusing on the system, do you have any concerns that you're sort of like missing the forest for the trees, that there's actually like a different problem? I don't know that I could name it myself, but like the system has stayed the same, but the outcome has, as you frame it, gotten worse. So is the system the problem?
That's a really good